Welcome to the debate on this July 14th, 2011, which is a national holiday in this country. The French Republic celebrates the 1789 storming of the Bastille prison in a rather, shall we say, martial manner. A giant parade, second largest of its kind in Europe outside of Russia. This proud show of might comes at a time when France finds itself, well, stretched with wars in Afghanistan and Libya, a post-conflict situation in Ivory Coast, 27,000 troops across 5 continents, and a defense budget that's not keeping pace in these belt-tightening times. Accentuating that soul-searching, the 6 soldiers killed in Afghanistan in the past 24 hours. That brings to 70 the number of French troops killed there since the 2001 invasion. How do the French feel about being at war? At a time when the U.S. is calling on its NATO allies to share more of the burden, what's the right size for France's armed forces? And just how much of Paris's influence on the world stage is down to its military might? Today in the France 24 debate, France on all fronts, and with us to talk about it, military historian Laurent Henninger of the Strategic Research Institute at Paris's École Militaire. I guess how we translate that as it's the
military school, but it's more the equivalent of what the Americans call the Staff College.
Exactly, or sort of a Sandhurst, you could say, for
no, Sandhurst is more for cadets.
Yeah,
so it's more a higher school for people who are already majors or lieutenant colonels and who are about to become colonels or generals.
And with a great location just behind the Eiffel Tower.
Yeah.
Also with us, retired Captain Philip Stoner. Welcome back to the show. Former Deputy UK Defence Attaché here in Paris. And Dave Clark, Deputy Bureau Chief for the French news agency AFP. We want to thank you, by the way, for weighing in on the conversation on the France 24 debate Facebook page. And you can also follow us and our guests on Twitter, our handle at François F24. Now, in case you've never been to Paris on July the 14th, the French celebrate their national holiday 3 ways: fireworks, firemen's balls, and a big parade down the Champs-Élysées. Laurent Henninger, why is it that France goes in for the big parade?
Well, it's a very old tradition that dates back to the Third Republic in the 1880s. You know, after the defeat facing Prussia in 1870, there was a big renewal of French patriotism in the following decades. The historians summed up that French feeling in these years as the sentiment de la revanche, the revenge, you know, until 1914. So these parades date back from that time. Actually, the 14th of July was instituted not to commemorate the storming of the Bastille in 1789, but the Fête de la Fédération.
1 year later.
1 year later, which is slightly different and more consensual.
All right, and that's an important footnote of history that's sometimes forgotten. Philip Stoner, what was your reaction when you saw your first Bastille Day parade?
I think, you know, sort of feeling that is a bit of harking back to the past. From the British point of view, it's not the way we do things in the UK. We have a trooping of the colour. It's slightly more measured. It's sort of not quite so sort of outlandish and brash. I think that was my perception, that there was something, in some ways, a bit of an echo of the past. I wasn't going to say Soviet-like, but there's that sort of feeling that we do things differently in Britain.
And do you think this kind of parade is still relevant today?
I think, you know, deep down the French love it, and they want sort of to see their soldiers and their troops out in full glory and so forth. There's something very much, as I've used before, the cricketing analogy, you know, working on the front foot, which is very, very sort of a French way of sort of playing cricket. The British tend to sort of say more on the back foot and, well, you know, let's be reserved. We're quite good at what we do, but we don't quite do it in the same way.
Laurent Henninger, one of the highlights of the parade is always the French Foreign Legion. And is it still the place, just a little anecdote here, is it still the place where young men of all nationalities can go to forget a broken heart or perhaps some past misdeeds?
Yes, pretty much so, yes. Well, there's a big difference with the previous Foreign Legion is today they don't accept real criminals anymore. I mean, 50 years ago it was possible, yes. When you were a real criminal, somebody who had killed someone, you could join the French Foreign Legion. Or if after the Second World War, many former SS joined the Foreign Legion, and many of these former SS fought for France in Indochina in the early 50s, for instance. But it's not the case nowadays. I mean, they accept, criminals, but petty criminals, and not major ones.
And let's use that as an example. Getting back to the question I asked Philip Stoner, when you look at the Foreign Legion, for instance, do you say to yourself that this is relevant, this is a good way, this structure is the right one for a country like France?
Why not? Why not? I don't understand the point of your question, if I may say. Yes, I think it's a very good unit with its flaws and but also its strength. And the French love the Foreign Legion in general. They mostly because there's some sort of romantic feeling about the Foreign Legion, very romantic. And there has been so many movies, for instance, about the Foreign Legion, even in Hollywood. Think about the fact that in the 1930s, France and Hollywood produced more or less as much movies each other about the Foreign Legion.
It's easier to love a unit when they die, their mothers aren't in France.
Yes, of course. Of course.
You don't see if they lose in battle and their families are not on television here.
Dave Clark, you've covered a lot of conflicts. When do you get the sense is there a French way of soldiering in one?
Well, in the recent conflicts I've covered, from the Balkans in Africa and latterly in the Middle East, I often encounter French officers who, and to a certain extent British officers, who compare the way they fight to the way the Americans fight and say that they're better at dealing with the local population, they're less aggressive, that they are better at this, what we now tend to call counterinsurgency, and dealing with the local population, not necessarily in a warlike way of building friends and networks of contacts in the local area. What I would, I think it's possible that they exaggerate this, because obviously they're still a war-fighting army. The Rafale is not a peacekeeping weapon, and it's currently dropping bombs in Libya. It's a kind of self-image that they promote, and they also use it to set themselves apart from the Americans a little. But the Americans themselves have learned a lot about this kind of warfare since 2006, 2007. When they realized things were going so badly in Iraq, they managed to alter their tactics quite significantly and quite quickly. So it's possible to exaggerate the extent to which the Americans are warmongers and the French are peacemakers. But there is that spirit in their officers that they do like to talk about in front of journalists.
If I may add, I think the Foreign Legion represents one of the several French ways, plural, of soldiering. You know, the French appreciate that romantic feeling about the Legion, because it is also the romantic appreciation of glorious defeats, you know, and shedding blood and all that in glory. But there are other French ways of soldiering, and the Legion is only one of them. For instance, there is a big rivalry within the French army between the Foreign Legion and the French Marines, which belong to the French army and not to the Navy. And the French Marines and the French Foreign Legion are utter rivals, and they have completely different ways of soldiering. For instance, what was said about that French tradition of mixing with populations and so on, that belongs to the French Marines, for instance, and not very much to the French Foreign Legion, which most of the time stays away from local populations.
Now, one of the big differences, a decade ago, they stopped in this country military service. And with combat now every day in Afghanistan, bombing raids every day in Libya, and in early April, a few short days of street fighting in Ivory Coast, well, you have a situation where the French haven't been this active, you could argue, in decades, or stretched as thin, as Le Monde pointed out, and in an article 2 days ago, in which entitled "The Risk of Overheating for the French Army." That risk comes amid, again, a decline in defense spending. And if we can look at the chart there, you can see since 1962, 5.2% of GDP when at the tail end of the Algerian War of Independence. Today, 1.6% of GDP. And if you compare those numbers with other NATO partners, well, you see that there are similar declines. But between, this is 2005 in blue and 2010 in green, you see that the French spending has gone down, whereas, of course, the US and Britain have gone significantly higher, again, in percentage of GDP. Philip Stoner, when you look at those numbers, what is the trend now? What's going to be?
Well, I think you've got to remember, of course, actually, what does that to produce in the way of figures, money on the ground, because there's a difference between the percentage of GDP and actually, what's it going to buy. I think there's a view that we now get more bang for our buck with our defence budgets. And there's a massive debate going on in the UK at the moment, trying to sort of say, well, look, what we're purchasing costs a great deal of money, but we must get better value for money. And I think that is spreading right across, certainly through UK and France, but other countries as well. We cannot go on basically pouring money into defence companies who are there basically sitting and waiting to produce wonderful bits of kit, but at vast price that we can't afford. So
and in the past, perhaps, as the former MP Tony Benn once quipped, it was a job creation scheme killing Germans to a certain degree, is the way he put it.
Well, I mean,
but being in, you had a military service in.
Well, indeed we did. I mean, as indeed did France. But I mean, but technically, from the technical point of view, military service was no longer tenable. We had to have a professional force. We had to have professional people who actually had an education and were able to stay for a certain amount of time, learn what they had to do. We couldn't just pick people off the street, give them sort of a gun and say, go off and let's have a war. And I know from the point of view of the French, back in the first Gulf War, there were huge problems with some of the sailors on board the Clemenceau who didn't want to go to war, and we had French MPs sort of complaining about it. So, there's an issue about, using the draft. The draft was no longer tenable.
When you see in this country that they've closed countless military bases in the past years and more to come, mostly in the east of the country, you look at that military parade today in Paris, do you say to yourself, as a result, it's no longer the same French army that it was a decade ago?
Well, of course, it's not exactly the same, although the paradox is that at the very same times, it is also the very same army. So it's, yes, of course, the army is downsizing critically. That's a major problem. But I don't think it's a different army. It's the same one, only a little bit weaker in terms of personnel and material. But I don't think the very essence of the French army has changed in the last years.
Now, as we mentioned at the outset, it was a Bastille Day. It's been a Bastille Day of mourning because of the 6 soldiers that were killed in a Tuesday suicide attack. 5 of them killed in a Tuesday suicide attack in Afghanistan's Sarobi province. Attacks There you see the headline in one of the French daily newspapers, Aujourd'hui en France, July 14th in morning attacks, which if you add the one more person killed in this Wednesday, brings to 70 the number of French troops killed since the start of the combat in 2001. Dave Clark, 6 killed in 2 days. Is that a game changer?
It's in terms of numbers, it's something that the army can sustain. Given the size of the French army, 6 dead people is a tragedy for the families, but it doesn't strategically alter France's position on the ground. But politically, the French force is in a difficult position. The last poll that I saw was only 28% support among French voters for continuing to take part in the NATO mission in Afghanistan. And there's an election coming up next year. Already opposition candidates, Martine Aubry and François Hollande, have said that they want to speed up the withdrawal timetable. I think this is an issue, in fact, for lots of NATO governments, but it's particularly sharp for France. And now France has gotten itself involved in Libya as well. There have been reports in some of the French press that President Sarkozy has been pushing his commanders for a quick result in Libya. This isn't just a strategic problem, it's a political problem at home, and it's an economic problem, as Philip was discussing.
Even though, as Philip was
bang for our buck, cost a lot more bucks. If you don't use them, that's fine, but they're dropping concrete bombs on Libya, lumps of rock. They're dropping them fast, and they're smashing tanks. It's probably an efficient way of using money, but they probably wouldn't be doing that if they had a lot more Hellfire missiles.
But as Philip Stone was saying, it is a professional army now. Are you sometimes surprised at how little coverage those killed in conflicts like Afghanistan get?
As a Brit, I have to say I'm a little surprised by that in France. We were discussing before the different perceptions of the parade. In the UK, our military tradition is very similar. We have an imperial past, and we are a country that has punched above its weight militarily, even post-war. But there's a I suppose if you're looking at negative, there's a sentimentality about the armed forces you encounter in the United Kingdom. A lot of people turn out for military funerals. We don't have a big July 14th style parade, but local military events still attract positive coverage in our press. The French military, now that they're no longer a conscript force, are not drawn from a broad section of the population. They're, as you can saw in the parade today, they were deliberately playing up the number of people who have come in from the overseas territories. But they are, in fact, they have programs in the overseas territories where there's very high unemployment to involve more people in the armed forces there. I'm sure they're great soldiers, but you know, in the Foreign Legion, they aren't even French citizens. As they close this network of bases in the poorer areas of eastern France, they're becoming less and less connected to the population as a whole, and the media here doesn't have such a sentimental relationship with the armed forces. They're not called our boys in the same way as you'd see in the British tabloids, for example.
You say in the British tabloids. When we come back, we're going to look at the specific missions of those French forces. This year, by the way, who were celebrated for, there was a special tribute to those who come from France's overseas territories and departments. Hence the fact that you saw at the military parade the Haka, the Maori war cry. Stay with us. The France 24 debate continues.